So want to welcome everyone to our Hixon Teacher Talk. My name is Dr. Leticia Rojas. I see some of the names that are familiar. I'm education faculty and the Hixon Teacher Prep Coordinator at Pasadena City College. I definitely recognize a lot of folks from child development, education, and then I'm sure across different departments. But I'm very, very excited to introduce to you a good friend of mine and someone who has a lot of experience in education and working with all students. But specifically today, he's going to talk about how to work effectively and in an empowering way with boys and young men of color. But Eduardo Lopez is a third-year doctoral student in the Urban Schooling Division at UCLA's Graduate School of Education. Prior to the doctoral program, Eduardo taught for 12 years at Theodore Roosevelt Senior High School, Roosevelt in Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles, as a social studies teacher, activist, and educator. At Roosevelt, most recently, he taught ethnic studies and bilingual U.S. history. In addition, he's created and directed for 8 years the Urban Scholar Compadres program, or Brotherhood program at Roosevelt, a program aimed at increasing the academic and personal success of young Latinx male-identified students. And so please welcome Eduardo Lopez. What he's going to do is he's going to be presenting today on his work, and what I'm going to be doing is making sure that I take a look at the chat box. So if at any time during his presentation you have any questions, please, or any comments, please make use of the chat. And at the very end, we're going to open it up to Q&A, and I'll be sure to look at the chat for those questions. But without further ado, Eduardo.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rojas, and thank you all for having me. I hope that folks are doing okay, that they're, that you're staying safe and healthy, and your loved ones are healthy too during these uncertain times, right? But yeah, thank you for having me as a guest to share a little bit of the work that I did at Roosevelt High School. And so I will try my best not to put you all to sleep. And so hopefully the presentation will hopefully be engaging to where, we'll have a lively discussion at the end of the presentation. Okay, so Dr. Rojas, so just go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, okay. I think that's that one. Okay, yeah, we're good to go, I believe, yes. Let's see, okay. All right, folks, so as Dr. Rojas mentioned, I taught for 12 years at Roosevelt High School as a social studies teacher. I taught the gamut of history courses. More recently, I taught 9th grade ethnic studies, as she mentioned, which is also a high school requirement at Roosevelt High School, and I'll just call it Roosevelt for short. And I also taught bilingual U.S. history. I was also the founder of the Urban Scholar Compadres, so I will be speaking about that program this afternoon with y'all. And as she mentioned, I'm no longer in the classroom, so I am currently pursuing my PhD in urban education. So let's move into the next slide. So this is a look at the Urban Scholar Compadres at Roosevelt High School. Okay, something happened here. That's not allowing me to change slides, so let's see, sorry about that. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. For those not familiar with Roosevelt, it's actually located in Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles. So in 2010, in my 5th year of teaching, the principal at the time, Ms. Gonzalez, approached me about a concern she had in regards to our male students. At the time, Roosevelt High School was making a concerted effort in bringing parents for various reasons. One of those was to have intervention for students with behavioral or disciplinary issues, which in the long run, of course, affected their grades and their success in the classroom. And so I was often invited to attend these meetings for those students who were in my class, but that I did not necessarily have a behavioral disciplinary issue with. So at these gatherings, there was a united front that we'd put together of counselors, the principal, teachers, to show support with parents as far as finding solutions to the disciplinary and behavioral issues of their sons. And overwhelmingly, the students in these meetings were males. And so one day after a meeting, as what I have here on the slide, the principal, Ms. Gonzalez, said, Eddie, we need to do something about our young men who are failing in large numbers and acting out in class, but I noticed not in your class. At that moment, I knew I had the backing for the administration to move forward with something I had been mulling over for some time, which is to create a program for young male scholars. And so I would eventually call this program the Urban Scholar Compadres. Yeah,
sorry, Eddie, just to
yeah.
interrupt. We can't see the slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I thought I shared it. And you are probably like, what's going on? Let's see, let's try that again. Fortunately, it wasn't. Let's see.
There we go.
Okay, I don't know why I went on full screen. Like, let's see if it allows me. It kind of blocked me. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. Okay.
Great.
All right, there we go. Thank you, Dr. Rojas. Okay, so yeah, so here's a quote. Here's a quote that the Principal Gonzalez had brought up. And from that point on, I knew I had the full approval of the administration to move forward with creating this program. But for those of you interested in going to teaching, one of the key things, and I think Dr. Rojas can also speak to, is that it's not really rocket science in terms of, finding out, kind of what's going on. A lot of times it's, building relationships. And I think some people go into the teaching profession and they forget about the humanizing component that goes into teaching. And so it's really important to build healthy relationships with our youth. And I think that's one of the things that was key and crucial for myself in developing meaningful, relationships with my youth that allowed me to reach them where I feel that other teachers might not have reached them. Okay, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, so before we jump into the presentation, I want to quickly provide an overview of this afternoon's presentation. So first, I'll speak a little bit about my personal educational history. And then I'll speak about the urgency for the Urban Scholar Compadres. I'll speak about the Urban Scholar Compadres program itself and what we did, highlighting some teaching practices and youth participatory action research, which I'll speak about more afterwards. And then we'll end with final thoughts and engage in a conversation. Okay, so a bit about myself. I am a son of immigrant parents. Both my mom and my dad are from Mexico. My mom is from a state called Sinaloa, and my dad was from a state known as Michoacán. Unfortunately, about a year after this picture was taken, when I was 5 years old, my dad passed away from cancer. At the time, I was too young to realize the impact this would have in my life, but nonetheless, I was fortunate to have an amazing mother raise me. I was also blessed to have a family to help her out. So as I got older, I realized the loss of not having a father in my life and became aware that folks spoke negatively about Latino and African-American boys who didn't have a father growing up. For some reason, I always felt I had to prove others wrong. And so after graduating from high school, I went to UCLA for my undergraduate studies. It was during my last year at UCLA that I decided to go into teaching. Speaking to other college students of color, I found out folks did not have the best K-12 schooling experience. And I began to reflect on my own experience and recognize that although I had great teachers who helped me develop my academic skills, I don't remember ever being asked to share about my home life. And so I felt there was an empty hole when it came to learning and sharing about my cultural identity. With the exception of one teacher, Mr. Limon, my science teacher, who spoke about the Chicano movement and who I still keep in touch with, there really was no other teacher who asked students to share in a meaningful way our personal lives, or who spoke about race or ethnicity, let alone about gender, sexuality, class, oppression, inequities, and injustices, all of which were topics I wish I could bring into the classroom. And so I went into the teaching profession to be the teacher I wish I had, and to hopefully be a positive male influence for my students. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know why, Dr. Rojas, every time like it kind of, let me see. There we go, okay. Much better. And I'm going through a lot of, oh, there we go. All right. Okay, so after my teaching credential program, I was hired at Roosevelt High School, a school rooted in activism. Having been one of the East Side schools that walked out in the 1968 blowouts, I was very proud and fortunate to be hired in such an amazing school at the time with just so many great teachers. I also closely worked with Dr. Rojas there, and so I was blessed to work with her as well. But as my teaching career began, I quickly noticed that young Latino males struggle the most, and for various reasons. And so that took me to a journey where I realized that my experience was not unique and not just a Roosevelt issue. According to a report from the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, a study done on the education pipeline, as this graph shows, Latinas and Latinos compared to other major racial ethnic groups are further behind in the education pipeline. If you see on the left-hand side, right, where it says Latinas and Latinos, so out of every 100 Latinx elementary students, the 63 represents Latinas and the 60 represents Latinos. So out of every 100 Latina elementary students, 63 Latinas will graduate from high school, and 60, right, Latinos will graduate from high school. And so the lower number in the following columns are of Latino educational attainment. So out of 100, 11 Latinos will receive an undergraduate degree, 3 will graduate with a master's, and 1 will receive a doctoral degree. And so to complicate that a little further, if looking at this chart, right, on figure 2, now among Latinas and Latinos subgroups, Chicanas and Chicanos and Central Americans had the lowest educational attainment. And the group with the highest dropout rates amongst all groups are Latino males. And so I was thinking about this at that time. And I also thought about, you know, to further complicate this reality, folks spoke about the school to prison pipeline. Now, many of you might be familiar with this graph. I just want to highlight a few things when discussing this pipeline. On the bottom left-hand corner, it says 68% of all male and in-state and federal prison don't have a high school diploma. And underneath that, it says 1 out of 3 African Americans will be incarcerated in his lifetime, and 1 out of 6 Latino males will have the same fate. So aware of these statistics, I was determined, however small, to do something to actively address the cracks in the Chicano educational pipeline and to engage male youth in conversations about hegemony and oppression. And so in the fall of 2010, I established the Urban Scholar Compadres. With support from my administrator, as I previously mentioned, I convinced a fellow colleague of mine, Mr. Melendez, who, like me, identified as a male Chicanx and was interested in supporting the program. And so we co-taught an advisory period of 25 minutes, which isn't a lot of time, but I'll speak more about that in a bit. So we co-taught this for a semester. And things were going great because we're starting to begin to build a program working with these young male students. But unfortunately, due to scheduling issues, Mr. Melendez and I were only able to co-teach for a semester. And so from then on, it was pretty much me working with the boys. But this is our kind of mission and vision of the program. And so I'll read it as stated here. It says, Urban Scholar Compadres is a program aimed at increasing the academic and personal success of young men of color at Roosevelt High. The Urban Scholar Compadres builds critical and active agents of social change who are academically, socio-politically, and culturally empowered. Our scholars do graduate level critical research using youth participatory action research. To achieve this, we ground scholars in a culturally sustaining curriculum to develop academic and community organizing skills. The scholars are trained to organize and mobilize in order to improve educational outcomes for themselves, but more importantly for the community. And so what I want to kind of transition to now is to provide you all kind of the structure of the class, right? So here's a brief overview of the program. And so in any given year, there were about 10 to 15 9th through 12th grade scholars. Scholars became immersed in a curriculum that was humanizing, valued their cultural heritage, created strong opportunities for academic achievement. In this program, youth built knowledge of self for personal and social transformation. And the structural, and I say the structure of the ideal class was because of the 8 years that we existed, there was only 1 year that they actually allowed us to function as a 60-minute elective course within the school matrix. And so later on, I'll share a little bit of the research that they did and how we were able to accomplish that in that year span. But other than that, we actually functioned as an advisory period for 25 minutes, which didn't allow us a lot of time. And so what we did was actually meet as often as we could after school, at least once a week, between 1 to 2 hours. And so that's kind of what sustained us through that time. But I also want to mention that in our second year, we partnered with a nonprofit called the Social Justice Learning Institute. They're located in Inglewood. And they were and are still committed to working with young Black and brown men of color. They helped us develop our year-long curriculum. They funded and organized university field trips as well. And so that's what you kind of see there. The year-long curriculum, critical literacy development, research-oriented learning, higher ed exposure, and always our goal was to build with the community. Let's see, sorry about that. Okay. Now, for those of you considering going into the teaching profession, here are some crucial, pedagogical and theoretical frameworks to become familiar with if your goal is not just to be a social justice, but a racial justice-oriented educator. Considering the time constraints we have for this afternoon's presentation, I'll leave this slide up for a second if anyone will stop before moving into the next slide. There's plenty of overlap between these frameworks. I just try to compartmentalize them in an easy to read format. I figure I can just show how these pedagogical and theoretical frameworks looks like in practice with the Urban Scholar Compadres and how that informs praxis as well. So these are some of those major ones, right? Critical pedagogy and pedagogical teaching practices, YPAR, critical race theory, and Latino critical race theory. All right, just gonna move on to the next slide. Okay. And so as a reflection of the pedagogical and theoretical frameworks mentioned, building community is paramount if you want to work and engage youth in critical dialogue. And so as part of our humanizing pedagogy, we understood Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which actually takes and builds off the indigenous Blackfoot Nation's belief system. So that prior to self-actualization, many needs have to be met. One in particular is a sense of love and belonging. So on the left-hand side of this slide are pictures from our yearly retreat. Every year, I, working in partnership with the Social Justice Learning Institute, the nonprofit that I mentioned, would take our scholars up to Big Bear on this yearly retreat. And for many of our boys, it was the first time they had ever gone to the mountains, which was powerful to hear how they felt about that and being in a different surrounding. On these retreats, we built community by engaging in various activities from team building, academic, to identity development exercises. We had our boys learn to cook and clean for others. And more importantly, these retreats allowed my young scholars the opportunity just to breathe, reflect, and see how they would organize to agitate for positive transformation at school and in their community. And on the right-hand side, is a picture of our annual bow tie event. This event actually came along as a suggestion from our counselors and parents center. They recognized that for some of our boys, they were seeing a positive change or boost of confidence in being in the program, and that we should recognize them with a formal luncheon. And so from then on, we decided that every year we'd have a bow tie event where our boys would invite a role model in their lives. This could be a parent, a relative, a teacher. So all participants were encouraged to dress up, wear a bow tie, and to come with an appetite to break bread. So we would have a guest speaker during our 2-hour event and would also have our boys and the role models engage in activities. This was intentional to allow our boys the opportunity to express their appreciation to the person they invited. This event was special for so many reasons, especially because for many of our boys, sharing and expressing emotions was and is something that they don't do often. And so moving to the next slide, thinking about, right, a humanizing pedagogy and community building, it's all about love, right? And I think that's something that, sometimes we forget, or folks don't really mention as often, the importance of love in doing this work. And so in thinking about that concept of love, we're thinking about, folks who have engaged with the community, right? How our curriculum is community responsive, and thinking of folks who have committed their lives to, right, Boyle Heights. And so as part of our community responsive curriculum, my scholars read college level text. For example, every year we would read critical race scholar, Professor Tara Yoso's Community Cultural Wealth piece. And in that piece, she spoke about community cultural wealth reframing this deficit perspective of communities of color as these barren wastelands with nothing to offer, and instead focused on identifying various forms of rich capitals or assets that exist in those communities. And so when I asked my scholars, what are some community assets in Boyle Heights for men of color, my scholars identified that the ones most rejected and discarded in the Boyle Heights community were usually gang members or formerly incarcerated Latinos. And so they said the organization that was an asset and believed in second chances was Homeboy Industries. And so for those of you not familiar with Homeboy Industries, part of their mission statement says that they provide hope, training, and support to formerly gang involved and previously incarcerated men and women, allowing them to redirect their lives and become contributing members of the community. So my boys decided to interview Father G, founder of Homeboy Industries. And here's what he had to say in response to one of their questions about what has made Homeboy Industries so successful. So let me see if I could show that to you. I hope this will work. Okay.
And so, but I think our secret sauce is the community, you know, and that becomes very compelling because in the end, community will trump gang. You can't just wag your finger at gang members. You can only kind of help them put their finger on it. Oh, I see. I used to think my neighborhood, my gang, my barrio had my back and unconditional love. No, that wasn't true at all. But they can only see that in the light of real community. So this place shines a bright light on the dark corner of their gang past. And that's the only way they're able to say, well, that was bankrupt, that was shallow, that was empty. I didn't know that until I saw the real deal, what real community is, what unconditional love is. Because gangs are about conditional love. One false move and you're out. And that happens all the time. Here we talk about a no matter whatness. No matter what, we got you. No matter what, we have your back. Gangs say that, but nobody believes it. So you asked me one question, I give a long ass answer.
All right, so we'll go back. Thank you, Father G, for always helping out. But thinking about this, from this interview, my boys began to ask, how come Father G could have this whatever whatness attitude for all those who come to Homeboy Industries, but at Roosevelt there were teachers who didn't believe in them? So why were they not afforded a second chance or looked at positively in the way Father G looked at formerly incarcerated men and women? So after this conversation with Father G, he appreciated what we were doing with our program, and he decided to donate a set of his book, Tattoos on the Heart, that became required reading for our program. In this book, many of my boys were able to see their community in a different light, not just the negative, but the positive and beauty, and also the structural injustices that have led to certain conditions in Boyle Heights. This is an example of community responsive curriculum, where we tapped into the community to teach us, to question, and to grow. So our curriculum is also culturally sustaining in that we learned about our past, our indigenous history. In one area outside the school campus, there are murals at Roosevelt depicting Mesoamerican history leading up to the present. We would use the art that existed in our community to learn about our indigenous roots. This is what you see on the picture on the left-hand side. On the right are my boys reading and analyzing a graduate level text by Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade called Note to Educators, Hope Required when Growing Roses in the Concrete. From this reading, my boys discuss ways that teachers could recognize their culture and their contemporary lives. Their call to action was for teachers to have critical hope, to be in solidarity with them, and understand the challenges that exist outside the school. Okay, so now moving to the kind of the second half of typically of the academic school year with my young scholars. During the second half of the year, they engage in youth participatory action research. And so this really came as a result of the scholars wanting to take some kind of action after learning about different forms of oppression. And so YPAR is action research that lends itself to this. And so the guiding principles of YPAR are listed here, right? That it motivates intellectual and social engagement by encouraging students to explore meaningful questions. So that means that the youth, right, my scholars are the ones determining what they want to research in their community and what they want hopefully to shed light on and address. Also, they build knowledge through social inquiry with peers, educators, and community members. So this is not just, you know, you let the youth go ahead and just explore on their own. YPAR is very much grounded in being in partnership with adults, adult allies who also have very similar, right, goals and objectives as far as making sure that, hold on, sorry. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Dr. Rojas?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Because I had unplugged my earphones or earbuds. Sorry. So yeah, so that's the second guiding principle. And the third guiding principle is that they work towards a more participatory, inclusive public sphere to create change in schools and communities. And so the end result isn't just to present, but hopefully, right, in some way to enlighten, but also to have marching orders about what they can do, but also what you in the audience, if you're there, right, what the responsibility, the collective responsibility to address whatever research topic they're obviously doing the research on, which I'll be sharing in just, I think, the next slide here. Yes. And so the next set of slides will briefly show part of a larger YPAR project that my scholars engaged in. And this is the result of a year, right, of a year-long project of when I was afforded that 1 year that I mentioned between the 8 years that we existed to function as an elective course within the school day. So at Roosevelt, just to kind of give you some context, at Roosevelt, our school had adopted restorative justice to shift from the zero tolerance punitive measures to a restorative process. Studies had shown that Black and brown bodies at schools were disproportionately suspended at higher rates than their white counterparts. And so as a result of student groups, parents, and community organizations, the Los Angeles Unified School Board District adopted this Bill of Rights for students, this positive school Bill of Rights. And within it, they had said that schools would then begin to adopt restorative practices as an alternative. And so my boys were interested in finding out the impact that this was having on Roosevelt, because Roosevelt actually had volunteered to be one of the first few schools within LA Unified to embrace and begin to adopt this shift to restorative justice. And so they wanted to see how these practices, the impact that these practices were having on campus, but also could potentially curb the school to prison pipeline by building through community. And so the main research question that they had was, in what ways does RJ Community Building Circle impact the classroom environment when it's implemented within classroom instruction? They also had some sub-questions that went with this. Their goals in participating in this YPAR project, they made it very clear that they were doing this because they wanted youth to be given the opportunity to address disparities and to have a voice with active stakeholders about what was going on in their schools. They also wanted to show that Latino males could be valuable assets in taking leadership roles and improving the conditions in their communities. They, of course, wanted to agitate power structures to create equality. They wanted to build healthier relationships with key stakeholders. And they also wanted to provide an alternative image and perception of Latino males to the dominant gangster illiterate narrative that exists on television. And they also got down on research, right? So here's a slide on their methodology. So they did both quantitative data collection and qualitative data collection. And they surveyed over 373 students. And they realized that they tried to survey teachers on multiple occasions by sending email blasts, and teachers were not responsive. And so they were critical about that too. They said, how come they want us to do all their assignments on time every single time, but yet we ask them to do this and they're not doing it, right? They also engaged in qualitative, the qualitative data collection process, where they interviewed students, teachers, counselors, deans, the police officer we have on campus, and so forth. And from that, let's see, sorry. They also learned about what restorative justice was. So they realized that restorative justice is about building community to celebrate accomplishments, intervene in offending behavior, transform conflict, rebuild damaged relationships, reintegrate students in the learning environment. So they began to kind of embrace and breathe, right, RJ, and really push back too on certain things that they didn't really understand. But I'll mention how we were able to grow and understand restorative justice as a paradigm shift, and not just as practices as alternatives to discipline. And so here are two findings that from this project. There's other findings, but I felt that these were very relevant. They realized that many students feel that RJ at the end is better at addressing student conflict and issues instead of punishing them with suspension or expulsion. They also found out a number of teachers are not aware of the problems that students deal with on a daily basis. And so that's why it's important for restorative justice not only to be solely focused towards students, but with the inclusions of teacher, parents, and other staff in order to build stronger relationships. So they realized, you know, the 3 R's of restorative justice, that we have to develop respect with one another, and that establishing respect will lead to relationships. And by fostering these relationships, it'll lead to a responsibility, so that there's this collective cycle of these R's, of these 3 R's, that hold people accountable in a meaningful way. And so they began to notice that, you know, can RJ, right? They realized that RJ was, you know, having some success on campus, but they said, can this actually be done not just at the school level or district level or state level, but what about at the national level? And so our research took us to New Zealand. And so as it states here on this slide, New Zealand is the, you know, one of the world's strongest examples of running their entire youth juvenile system to a restorative justice model. And so fortunately, because of one of the professors I mentioned, Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, through a relationship that we have with him, he connected us with a high school in New Zealand called Kia Ora College. And it's a bilingual school of Maori and Pacifica languages that folks learn. So it's kind of like a dual immersion school. And it's there that when we first actually started to speak to the principal, that we thought we were on the cutting edge as, you know, one of the first schools in LUSD to adopt and embrace restorative practices. And then very much we were schooled, like we were humbled right away, because as this quote states, right, the Maori indigenous folks actually have been doing this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so what we know as restorative justice, and I'm probably butchering the term, but it's called hu wakatika, and which means like restoring harmony in a person's life. And so we learned a lot from our, with our correspondence with this high school. And we also were able to Skype with these folks. And so we were able to Skype with, students, you know, in speaking, to students and to youth on the other side of the globe, my scholars realized a few things: that the struggle for historically marginalized groups in the US and New Zealand is very similar in the past and in the present. And that having a critical ethnic studies curriculum at schools that validates their culture, their language, their history, and develops youth agency should be the norm. And that restoring harmony in communities is crucial if society wants to create a better future. And so these were one of the huge takeaways that my young scholars took from this project. And so thinking about, you know, by engaging in this YPAR project on restorative justice, my scholars were embodying the concept of transformational resistance. And that actually is stated like in our theoretical framework, that they were becoming these empowered agents of change. They were critiquing oppression and how they saw how some students were treated by adults on campus, and the way police have and continue to mistreat Black and brown bodies in the communities. They were also moving towards social and racial justice by making sure more teachers, staff, and community embrace restorative practices to develop humanizing relationships with Latinx youth that have been historically marginalized and underserved in this country. And so here are a few photos of where my scholars have presented their work. So they actually, on the left-hand side, they presented to various teacher education programs, from UCLA, UCR to Cal State Dominguez Hills. On the right-hand side, they presented to also at our yearly youth-led conference that we have at Roosevelt High School. So here you see the youth leading circle. And so they're engaging adults and students in the process of RJ. And they've also participated in walk-ins and walkouts with other student activist groups on campus. And so I also want to state, that although, you know, I've been highlighting a lot of our successes, this work is also physically and emotionally exhausting. In addition to teaching a full set of classes, I committed myself to 8 years of this program. And so a major reason for our success was because it was done in community. So here is a picture of my boys with our RJ coordinator, Michelle Ferrer. She was crucial to our RJ paradigm shift and understanding of restorative justice practices. She was a huge ally and asset. Here's a picture of Omar Ramirez. He's a community artist. He's the gentleman in the back with the cap. So he's a community artist, an educator, an activist, and he became an integral part of our program the last few years, providing tons of support. And in this picture, I want to recognize the partnership we had with the Social Justice Learning Institute, but more importantly, with the parents who believed in our program and trusted me with their babies. And so I want to end this presentation with two quotes from two of my boys, and then I'll show a short video they created along with my last slide on showing up for my boys when it counted. And so in this, and so the impact of the program, in this, question that I had for Abraham, I asked, what does it mean to you as a Latino male to be in this program? And he said, as a Latino male, I have to go through things that others don't. What this program has done is not only opened my eyes to these circumstances, but has equipped me with the necessary tools required to bring change. As a Latino male, I am able to communicate with both Spanish and English speakers in my community and start the change there. During our YPAR presentations, I always remind the audience that I am a transformational resistor because I am proving the statistics wrong. I am not a gang member and I'm not dropping out of school. I am going to disrupt the school to prison pipeline by graduating in June. I also plan to be a good role model and stay connected with my urban scholars brothers so they graduate too. And so here's just an example, that it's not just about himself, but it's thinking about his community and also, to stay connected with the program. And so thinking about the mission and empowering young men, I'm very proud of Abraham for the way in which, he very articulately was able to express what the program meant to him. And for the next, for the next quote I have here, I also asked, the scholars what they think of me, Mr. Lopez, being the facilitator, if they could recall moments where they felt a connection with me, moments where they felt frustrated with me. And this is what Leon had to say. He said, Mr. Lopez represents the embodiment of what a urban setting educator should teach. I view Mr. Lopez as a second father to me. Mr. Lopez, also being of Mexican descent, is able to empathize with the struggles that I face. I learn from him, but through the work we do, he is also able to understand the impact social justice-based work can have on a student of color. I believe teachers within education should be trained to teach in the same or similar manner in which Mr. Lopez teaches, to empower young individuals. And so, of course, this means a lot because considering my, my own personal history and knowing that, that he saw me as a father figure, I take, a lot of pride and I'm very humbled by that comment, but it just shows that a lot of this program was centered on building relationships. And so that, is something that I think was key and is key to working with youth. And so now I want to show the video that they actually created of a short PSA about the program.
I matter because I am ready for the future. I'm a hard worker who stands up for others and treat others with respect and equality. I'm afraid of many things. I'm afraid to see what's next. It's better to see it than to never see what you could become. I know I'm not perfect, but in reality, what is perfection? I matter because I am prepared for the future, hungry for knowledge, and I even try to fit in with what society wants me to be. But that isn't the real me. I am afraid of failure and I even fall for temptation. Yet, I am encouraged to become a young leader. But I am not the only one that matters. What really matters to me is my familia.
We matter because society doesn't know we're prepared or not. No one knows who we are because they don't want you to know. But if you do, you'll know we're a brotherhood. We might be afraid of growing up, but that doesn't change who we are. Our lives matter because we don't want to be afraid of the future. But now it's our time to make a change.
Okay, so that was a PSA that they created, and then I will wrap up with my last slide here. So the last thing I want to say is, growing up, I would have never have thought that one day, I would create and co-construct a program for young Latino males. That when my principal asked me what we can do for our struggling boys, that it would lead to an 8-year journey, and that I would proudly stand next to my scholars on the day of their graduation. disrupting and debunking statistics and negative portrayals of Latinos one scholar at a time. So I want to thank you for your time. I know that, I've been speaking for close to like 40 minutes now. So thank you. And I will stop sharing the screen so that we could get into Q&A with Dr. Rojas and yourselves. But thank you for bearing with me as well. This is the first time I've done a full presentation on Zoom or on online platform. So it's really odd for me not to kind of see people's faces or engage and feel the audience. So very different times. Yeah. But thank you.
No, I want to thank you. That was really wonderful to hear about your work, and as someone who worked alongside you for a lot of years, and seeing those familiar faces on your slides, it's beautiful work. I'm encouraging folks to type their questions into the chat box, but we already have a couple. Some folks said they're familiar with Homeboy Industries, and so definitely applauded your connection to them. One of the questions goes back to the slide about how many, about the pipeline, the educational pipeline.
Wow.
And they noticed that dated back to 2012. And so they were wondering if things have gotten a little bit better in terms of statistics of how many Latinx students are graduating at this point.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I've reached out maybe about a year ago about that chart, because I had gotten it from one of the professors that I've taken courses with had told me about the chart, and I had seen it before. And so that I know of, that might be the last one or the last iteration I've seen. I think there should be one coming up. But from what I've heard, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Rojas, but I think the numbers have gotten better. They have gotten better in terms of for Latino graduation rates. I'm not sure how much better, but I still know that the numbers or the highest dropout rates across gender and also across ethnicity and and the subgroups within Latinos is still Latino males or male identified Latinos.
Yeah, as far as I know, the patterns are similar, but the numbers have gotten fortunately they've gotten better in terms of high school graduation, and we do see that Latinas and so when it comes to Latinas and African American women are some of the highest growing number of students in colleges. But our young men are still struggling at times.
And I do see that there's a question that says, what about girls and women of color?
Yeah.
And so that's a really great question, because as I mentioned, I stepped out of the classroom for 3 years now. And so as the program, as we were growing the program, I wanted to spend time highlighting our successes, but there's also been challenges, right? And part of the challenge that we had was, our existence. It was difficult sometimes to, keep the boys committed, every week after school for 1 to 2 hours to come in, considering that some of them were in sports, had other obligations. And so it was kind of like a roller coaster ride sometimes. From year to year, it varied with the young scholars that we had. But very much when it comes to, what you're saying, Dr. Rojas, in terms of specifically African-American women or young women, right? Being the numbers increasing substantially and being the highest numbers of, folks who get incarcerated and at the moment, and for Latinas as well, there very much is a need for coalition building. And I feel that if there were, right, and I'm hoping to bring back urban scholars, that it would be like a 2.0 version where we bring in, our sisters as well into the process, right? And that was one thing that was also a challenge. I know there were moments that I did want to do coalition building and maybe expand the program, but not just be, to like co-facilitate myself and, one of the female teachers at Roosevelt, but even, thinking of yourself, Dr. Rojas, and others. I know that folks had just so much on their plate, especially for teachers who get extremely involved with their students. In a lot of schools, unfortunately, we tend to be the ones that everyone looks at in terms of like piling on more and more responsibilities, and it shouldn't be that way. And so I very much see the need for that coalition building, but also programs for our sisters. And I know that the Social Justice Learning Institute, the nonprofit that I spoke about, which you could also find online, they first started as well working with specifically Black male youth, and then they expanded to Latinos, and now they're working with both young men and women.
Yeah, Thank you for that. There's another question that is asking, for those who are already finished high school but would like to continue their education with mentors like yourself, what programs do you recommend?
Mm. That one, yeah, that one's interesting because it depends, I feel a lot of times where you find your community sometimes too, right? So for example, like I know for the folks in Inglewood, that Social Justice Learning Institute that I'm talking about is still vibrant. It's, it's still growing. They have ongoing support for alumni in terms of providing work at their center. I know that, through colleges, right? Like your college at PCC, I know that I'm hoping, right, that there's some type of programs that exist that you could reach out to. For myself, that's one of the kind of like critiques that I have for myself as well, was that the way we built the program, it really was a lot of, driven by me and the allies that I mentioned that helped sustain us. But there was not an infrastructure that existed so that when and if I left, that the program continued at Roosevelt. So at the moment, there is no urban scholar Compadres at Roosevelt. But I think, I don't necessarily have answers for that, but I would hope that, wherever you find your community, whether it's, in college or within cities, that there might be some entities that exist, or even reaching out to say, even like, I would say maybe even some like nonprofits that might be able to direct you in hopefully finding those mentors that, similar to myself and others that are doing amazing work.
Thank you. There's another question that's asking, do you think movies or media plays a role in people's perceptions of boys of color? Absolutely.
Right. I think, what's that Netflix series that was great on the, When They See Us, is it right? Yeah, that one, I think that one kind of highlighted a lot, which I think the PBS documentary also did a fabulous job in terms of the Central Park Five. But I think that media does, play a huge role. Like I've been wanting to watch a lot of TV series, and of course I'm always critical, but I'd like to see more like of a positive image of, young Latinos. I know I watched Gentified on Netflix just to kind of get a feel, because that's also in Boyle Heights where, where Dr. Rojas and I taught for many years. I've also started to watch Vida, right? I think that one's on Showtime, right? In terms of Boyle Heights. On my block, I started watching as well a bit. And so I'm just always trying to see kind of like, how are they depicting, when they depict, some communities, the characters. And I feel sometimes they might be, overly kind of stereotyped to fit in certain categories, instead of, just making folks just like regular folks, but just dealing with, different types of sets of challenges in their lives.
Great. There was a comment that was made, and I don't know if you could speak to this, although I know your work is with high school students, that a lot of what you talked about in terms of the pipeline starts as early as early childhood and preschool. And there's a lot of child development majors in this group, a lot of folks that are looking to work with little ones. And so any particular readings or advice or anything that you think that's come across that you've come across that potentially could support students as they work with diverse students?
Well, I think, having conversations with those folks, I think they might have like the better answers than I can, right? Because I focus most of my work with secondary. But what I did notice though, were sometimes, and you might recall this, Dr. Rojas, we worked together in a small school within Roosevelt at times, right? We went through so much transition at Roosevelt. But one of the highlights I remember were high school students would go, and whether it was reading or like go and help support in the elementary schools, that left a huge impression on the younger ones, because they were not seeing, old folks like us as teachers, but they were seeing almost like their peers or their brothers or sisters or the friend of their cousins and so forth, right? So I think they're, young folks are very impressionable when it comes to things like that. And even within high school, like when I had some of my seniors, because I had 9th to 12th grade young males in my program, sometimes the seniors would break certain things down to the 9th graders that might, they might have been acting up, not just in general, but just like kind of like life lessons, because they kind of had to learn the hard way. That was way more powerful than me telling them something, right? So I think, I think there should be a lot more of that, kind of like the vertical kind of building, right? That should occur within schools. I think that could, that would be a good conversation to have with, folks from, the elementary level to secondary, middle and high school level.
Yeah, no, I think you definitely, the importance of having also male teachers of color, right, in the pipeline, and whether it's early childhood all the way to the college level, the importance of that on other young men. This is a question about, the student says, I have a younger cousin who's graduating this year from high school, but he doesn't seem to get the full support from his family about going to college. What do you suggest, or what have you kind of come across that I can do to motivate, encourage my cousin to continue his education?
Ooh, yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, so okay, so he is graduating from high school. I'm reading it now again. Yeah, and then the support from parents. Yeah, the home situation, it might be challenging. I don't know the home situation. I know that sometimes it might be that they need to work to help out, right? In real time, they need, right, to be helping to pay bills, specifically in this time, right? So, also thinking about that, we're not, existing and live in a vacuum either. But I do see, right, if it seems like he does want to go to college, I think, what would be important perhaps is having conversations with the parents and maybe seeing kind of like how both things, there might be a balance between both things, right? Where there could still be some kind of part-time work and there still could be an opportunity for college. If the younger cousin also seems like he or she, right, really wants to, wants to go to college. I think also bringing in folks, like sharing their own experiences, I think, in having to juggle that reality. I think sometimes, when we can't imagine kind of like what that may look like, it becomes very difficult to move forward. I think sometimes in having folks that have gone through similar experiences and even sharing that with the family, right? I think that also kind of like has them breathe. And so I remember, and I think a lot of teachers, right, do this, or at least, teachers who might share similar backgrounds with their students. I know I would speak to the parents during parent conference nights, and I would share my own experience of having been, raised by a single mother and the concerns that she had. And so when sharing that with them, they kind of were like, oh, okay, because it wasn't like we're disconnected. It was like I could relate to those experiences. And I think that helped for a few of my students to kind of have their parents then support them going off to college.
Great. And maybe if you can speak to this, I think the majority of folks in this space, we have about 33 people that joined us today. That's a significant number. For most people in this space, they're about to enter the teaching profession. They might already work with kids, but they're in the process possibly of getting their credential in the future, or becoming an educator. Any advice for them as they enter the profession? Just anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, so they'll be starting their credential programs.
It ranges, but folks that are about to enter the profession, working either with early childhood all the way to possibly university setting.
I think my 12 years of being in the field. I mean, being in the classroom, because we know, right, especially for educators of color, that there's a high turnover rate. We know that it could be exhausting work because you might not end up in a placement, right, at a school that might be as supportive with your ideas if your objective is really to try to address, right, injustices as far as like being, socially and racially oriented as an educator to work with the youth. And so thinking about that, I think what helps sustain me at least, and might help for you, would be finding allies within your schools, right? So sometimes, the teacher cafeteria isn't the most pleasant place to be at, to get lunch and sit down, because there's a lot of deficit negative thinking going on, discussions about students. And so I wanted to get away from that toxicity there. And so then I would then find allies that I felt that I could build with. I also found networks, or we created networks at Roosevelt of, after school, like a politics and pedagogy collective, which I believe one of your presenters in about a month or so, or in a few weeks, she'll be speaking about, I believe, that collective if you come back for this series of talks. But that space was and has been and continues to be a real crucial space, because it's not just, you know, beginning teachers, but also veteran teachers that have, you know, this like-minded mentality in terms of going into not with the missionary, right, we're going to go save these kids, but more of like, how are we going to build and listen with them? And so that has also been really important. And then looking for entities that exist outside of the school that might help with your professional development, right? So I know in Los Angeles, we have a People's Ed movement. So a People's Ed movement is also a great critical space for scholars to come together. There's also, you know, even checking in with Dr. Rojas, there's also a lot of great, you know, literature out there in terms of like what theory is saying. And so it might be great to see how that theory actually plays out in practice when you're teaching. That might help also kind of like help, you know, kind of tweak and kind of, you know, help you, you know, kind of polish, right, kind of your teaching practices.
Great. Well, we want to thank you so much for being with us today. I know it's 5 p.m. folks, but want to thank everyone also in the audience for just being here, being present. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we follow up, send you the recording as well as the flyer for upcoming events. But thank you again, Eddie, for taking the time and, and sharing your great work.
Yeah, and thank you all for, you know, for allowing me the space to share my work as well, because it's been, you know, as I mentioned, 3 years that I stepped out of the classroom, and so it's great to, you know, to be able to share work that I'm really proud of, and especially the young scholars that I worked with and continue to have, you know, relationships and conversations with. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll be sure to follow up.
Okay.